Morning again. We're going to continue in our series on the journey to the resurrection. And last week we talked about how Jesus was anointed with a very expensive perfume 2 days before the Passover. And now here we are at the feast of the Passover, and the time has finally come for Jesus to be betrayed and to go to the cross. But before that, we find this episode right here where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. And a few years ago, I was studying this very story with somebody that was a seeker of who Jesus is, and their immediate reaction was, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, why is Jesus washing their feet, and shouldn't they be washing Jesus' feet? And it was one of those moments where it's like, yes, that's exactly the question I want you to ask. Like, I didn't even have to prod it. And here you go. You got it. And there's more in this story that we're going to unpack this morning. And it's not just that, well, they should be washing Jesus' feet, but Jesus is washing their feet. Actually, Jesus teaches us a lot of things that are difficult for us to not only comprehend, but for us to actually live by and for us to want to do. And one of those things that's actually difficult, especially for me, that Jesus teaches is the point of vulnerability. Because vulnerability is hard. Vulnerability is hard. And vulnerability is hard because you might get hurt. And not only is vulnerability the thing that's scary because we might get hurt, but rather there's a lot of things that we are called to do by God that are scary because we might get hurt. Being humble, it's something we want to do, but does that mean that I have to be hurt if I'm humble? Does that mean I have to be self-defeating if I'm humble? Is showing mercy to people dangerous for me because that means that I have to constantly get taken advantage of? Is that what Jesus is teaching us? You just always got to get taken advantage of, or you're not my disciple. Or servitude. Does that mean that I really am, just like humility, not worth anything really at all? And servitude calls me to say, please hurt me as long as you're happy. These are some of the things that we'll unpack this morning. Just the idea that humility and servitude is challenging because it suggests we are constantly taken advantage of and possibly without the right to the objection when we are truly taken advantage of. I once read about a preacher at a different church, and he was a new preacher at a place that was notorious for just cycling through preachers because they all had the gift of mercy. And what that meant was these were all preachers that just let the congregation walk all over them, and the congregation loved to hire preachers that they could walk all over, and whatever they wanted to do, they could get him to do it in whatever way. And you can imagine just how dangerous it was for the preacher and for the church and really for the community that was watching this happen within the church. And one preacher finally came and was like, we got to put a stop to this. Like, this is not the gift of mercy. This is not somebody being merciful to you. This is dangerous altogether. And so we're going to start all over. We're going to start with a brand new church, and we're going to relook at all the principles that Jesus teaches us and that the New teaches us about what a church is supposed to be and how this whole thing is supposed to work out based on God's plan. And so mercy, or humility rather, is not debility. Humility does not mean that I must be breaking myself. Humility does not equal debility, nor does servitude equal substandard. Servitude is not the equivalent of permission to abuse. And mercy does not equal timidity. We're at the Passover feast here in John chapter 13, verse 1. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The same God that had executed the command for the Passover all the way back in Exodus That same God is now in man form of Jesus, who is actually sitting at the table celebrating the very thing that he did for these people that he's sitting with many years ago. And they may not be understanding, these disciples, they're probably not understanding just the volume of exposure that they're getting to the one that made those things happen. You'll see how they're kind of missing just the gravity of the situation, as Jesus is now going to celebrate in person. God himself in person is going to celebrate the Passover feast for an even greater Passover. But as Jesus is now sitting down, he's ready to celebrate this Passover feast that he had taken part in many years before, and now in person. It says there in verse 1 that he had come to depart out of this world to the Father. And so there was once a departure, an exodus out of Egypt to go be with God's people. And now here Jesus is, knowing that his time to come out of the world and to go be back with the Father is about to take place now. This is not necessarily exodus. This is, I am going back to my real home. I came from the Father and I'm going to be back with the Father. And just as it points backwards, this feast, Jesus is here pointing to what's going to be happening in the future. Is the real exodus and the real departure, the real salvation to take place is not just from one kingdom into your own kingdom on earth, but from all of the kingdoms of the earth to the one true heavenly kingdom. And that's something to celebrate as well. And we'll celebrate once we finally get to that heavenly home, as we are then in person also with Jesus, celebrating once again everything that God has done for us. And so there's a departure here. And then there's also going to be the deliverance here, which kind of points backwards and forwards, and in this place, all the same at the same time. You were delivered from Pharaoh, and now Jesus, with his blood, with his sacrifice, will deliver us from sin. But it's Jesus who won't be delivered out of the hands of those that will kill him. And someday we'll all be delivered out of this world, and then finally with this Jesus that was not delivered. And all of that will lead to the death of the Passover lamb that's sacrificed at twilight. Jesus willing to be that lamb now to give that deliverance. And Jesus, who has humbled himself to be able to take on that role. The level of submission here to be that Passover lamb and to be killed and let people take him and kill him is really the mark of humility. Because if I was sitting in a room, and maybe you too, if you were sitting in a room and you thought everybody was your friend, but you knew that somebody there was going to betray you, would your first instinct be, it's all okay? Or would your first instinct be, I'm going to survive? If I know that you're trying to kill me or get people to come and kill me, I think I might get everybody else that's around me that I think is on my side to come against you and save me, right? If there was a time for Jesus, who knew that Judas was going to betray him, especially as we read that here in verse 2 and 3, during supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and he was going back to God, what should Jesus do? Peter, you know that sword? You know, yeah, the one you're going to cut off the ear with here in just a few moments. Actually, instead, how about you use that on Judas right now, and we can just avoid this whole situation, right? I mean, God, the Father, has put all things into Jesus' hands, right? So does that give Jesus the permission and the authority to be like, we're going to stop this right now, and we're going to do this a totally different way whatsoever? Jesus already knew what was going to happen, but Jesus won't do that. I'll just give the story away right there. And actually, instead, Jesus not only humbles himself to submit to the higher purpose that God has in place, not to save himself, but to save the whole world. Jesus not only doesn't do the killing of Judas Iscariot, his betrayer, which, I think would have been pretty just in my opinion anyway. Jesus does the opposite. And that he gets up and he takes off his garment and wraps a towel around himself, and he goes around and he starts washing the feet of all the disciples. And yes, even that disciple that would betray him. Jesus' humility was greater than self-service, even though the one that lives for self-service would probably not learn from Jesus' example of serving each other and loving each other. Jesus teaches Judas Iscariot, when he's washing his feet, knowing what he is about to do, there's more to you than just your own life and serving yourself. There's more to life than just your own selfishness, and I'm convinced that most of the problems in the world are due to people just having an ultimately selfish attitude, a self-serving attitude. Jesus teaches there's more to be gained in serving God than just to be associated with Jesus for the benefits. And Judas, frankly, has just been benefiting from his association with Jesus. I mean, we've looked last week how just being with Jesus puts money into the money bag that Judas is in charge of, and he'll take it out for himself. Being associated with Jesus gives Judas the opportunity to gain more money by turning him in, which he will do here in just a second. And so Judas' association with Jesus is strictly for his own benefit, it seems like. Whereas Jesus is trying to teach him serving God and his plan. There's more to be gained, both with each other and with the Father. And that's the example that Jesus lays down right there. You think Jesus would be right to condemn Judas in that moment right there? Judas will have his day. And the fact that we're talking about him right now with the understanding of everything that he did in truth, and knowing also that he will go and hang himself, he'll be the example for just that also. And we also understand that Judas will also serve the example as selfishness and betrayal. His name is kind of associated with it. And with all of that, Judas will still not escape the true judgment that's before God at the throne also. But in this moment right here, instead of Jesus executing a judgment, which since the Father's put all things into his hand and that day will come, Judas is actually shown mercy. And so Jesus, the one that has permission, has the authority to show the judgment, instead chooses something that's much harder to do and shows mercy. And the ability to show mercy seems to be associated with the one that has the ability, the right, to show judgment. And that's why we are often in awe of a situation where somebody does that, instead of giving somebody what they truly deserve. And that's why mercy is also greater than judgment, because the one in control of judgment is also the one that has control to show mercy. So as Jesus is washing the feet and showing mercy to Judas, who rightfully deserves death and judgment, is Jesus washing his feet because he's timid? Is Jesus washing feet because he's afraid to address the real problem of Judas' life? Is Jesus doing this because he's not allowed to say that something is wrong? Actually, Jesus showing mercy is showing that Jesus is showing his true power. I'll do this now, but your true time will come later. Mercy is not timidity. Mercy is power, and to be able to do it shows the power that we have over our own mind and our own control and our own self-discipline and our own emotions, as much as it shows that we have power to show it to somebody else rather than to judge them. Mercy is power. And so we're still at the Passover feast here. And the struggle here between Jesus and Judas is not the only struggle that's going on. Actually, if we look at the parallel account in Luke chapter 22, verses 22 through 30, you see that there's another struggle that's going on between everybody, and that is the struggle of the pecking order. Luke chapter 22 at the Passover feast reveals that even here the disciples are arguing, who's the greatest in the kingdom of God? Well, I'm better than you and I'm better than you. And actually, I think it corresponds to the fact that Jesus has already announced, one of you is going to betray me. And so obviously, if Jesus makes an announcement among all of you, you're going to start wanting to justify yourself. Well, it's not me because you know what? I believed Jesus would help me walk on the water. And it's not me either because I followed Jesus as soon as he called me. And it's not me, but I think it might be somebody over there that's reclining on the other side of the table. And this is obviously not the only time that the pecking order has been argued. Luke chapter 9, 46 to 48, after Jesus has been transfigured on the mountain, and God has called from heaven and said, "This is my son, hear him." And the disciples come down from the mountain, and then they all regroup there. It's time to have the argument. Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? There's also an episode in between there where Jesus heals a boy from an unclean spirit and then predicts his death and the resurrection. And all of that going along, and the disciples just can't help in front of Jesus, who has been proclaimed and approved by God from heaven and has power over spirits and the ability to tell him the great plan that's happening. They just can't help but want to argue who's better than who. You look back also to Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, and they directly ask Jesus, who's the best here? It's like children asking their parents, who's your favorite, right? The youngest always knows it's the youngest. They're not afraid to ask Jesus, what's the pecking order here? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 10 through 13, even after Jesus' ascension, it seems like it's still going on even among the churches. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter. Well, are you of Christ? Are any of these better than the other? Did any of these die for you? No, it was Christ that died for you. And so you have the regular struggle that's going on between the disciples as once again they are at the feet of Jesus, dining with him, remembering the Passover. And Jesus is washing their feet. You know, the tongue and the heart are both considered muscles, right? The tongue is made up of muscular tissue, the heart, a muscular organ. And yet, which of these is easier to exercise? The disciples are doing a really good job exercising their tongue. But it's Jesus who's exercising the heart. So in response to this, as Jesus has already shown them that to be the greatest, one not only must be like a child, but Jesus instead washes their feet. And traditionally, you might understand that coming into a home when you were going to sit down for dinner, or just in general, especially after traveling on a long road, when people generally wore sandals, their feet were going to be dirty. And so it was somebody's job to do the washing of the feet of the people that came into the house. It didn't matter if you took a whole bath before down at the river, you still had to walk home and your feet would be dirty, and somebody needed to wash those feet when you came into the house as a guest. And of a whole group that's arguing and exercising their tongue of who's the greatest, who do you think is going to wash the feet? Nobody. Nobody's going to submit to that task. Except God himself in the flesh. Jesus is raising their understanding of what it truly means to be great. John chapter 13. John chapter 13, verse 12. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I've done for you. You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should also do just as I have done to you. And truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Rather than Jesus pointing out the pecking order right then, or telling them, why did nobody wash my feet, and why did you all not wash my feet? You should get it by now that I am the greatest. Rather, Jesus is lifting their standard for each other, and for those they will reach out to with the message of Jesus. Servitude is not substandard. Is Jesus substandard in any way? Rather, servitude is transformative. As Jesus is transforming their hearts and their minds and their ideas about what is greatness. And Jesus is saying, let me lift up the standard that you live by in general. And by doing so, Jesus doesn't need to lower himself and say that I am the weakest and I am lower than you because I must wash your feet. Actually, Jesus continues to teach them, because I am the greatest, I will give you the commandment to serve and to love each other. I will show you my servant-heartedness, and that is the very thing that I will require from you. And watch how you change other people's lives through this. You ever had somebody do something for you that you just absolutely didn't deserve? And it could have been something small, it could have been something great or something like that. And in that moment, you were like really embarrassed. I've been there. It's like awkward and embarrassing when somebody's doing something for you and you're like, I would almost rather skip this whole experience right here and experience the problem that I was about to encounter rather than somebody doing something for me out of their own kindness. Because that feels better than the fact that somebody is humbly serving me and helping me. And yet that very moment is what calls us to also search internally and say, okay, well, if I'm experiencing the humility when this person is doing the serving, what needs to change in my life? Where am I not doing the serving? How can I change everybody else? Greatness is serving, and serving is changing people's lives. It's changing people's outlooks. It's changing people's intentions. It's changing people's actions. And what an example we can show other people in servitude, because servitude does not mean we are substandard people, believers, substandard children of God. Servitude is transforming other people. Just as Jesus was transforming the idea of loving your brother as yourself, loving your neighbor as yourself, living a life of serving, as the great master takes on the serving role in mercy. And even with all of his authority and power to call angels, but doesn't, and as God the Father, and all his wisdom and knowledge that Jesus has, as we have seen, not demanding that everybody else wash his feet, but he washes everybody else's feet. And even though Jesus deserves Judas to wash his feet like 1,000 times, Jesus' claim to humility right here is not him also degrading himself. It's not like, no, guys, I'm really a problem, and so that's why I'm washing your feet. I don't deserve you guys. That's why I'm washing your feet. I need you guys to help me and fix me. That's why I'm washing your feet. There is no self-defeating talk from Jesus when it comes to humility. There is no doubting of his self-worth when Jesus was washing his feet. There's no compliment fishing while Jesus is washing feet. Rather, the true humility of Jesus is plain and clear, as Jesus says, I will do this, and it'll honor you, but also I'm doing this so that I can honor the Father. I don't agree with all of Thomas Merton's theology by far, but he has this one really good quote. A humble man is not afraid of failure. In fact, he is not afraid of anything, even himself, since perfect humility implies perfect confidence in the power of God. And so humility and confidence are not opposites. Actually, they go hand in hand. Jesus himself is fully confident in his authority and who he is and his connection with the Father, even as he's washing the feet of the disciples. Jesus is upholding his humility and not putting people beneath him, and yet Jesus lifts up his disciples to a higher standard and a better way of living, and a transformative way of living, and a transformative way of teaching. That does not need to come with a compromise of self-worth, of value, especially a value that's come from God. And so Judas again puts Jesus beneath him, not only in the foot washing as Jesus is kneeling at his feet, but also in approving of everything that he will do to Jesus in betrayal and court and execution. But this does not lower who Jesus truly is. Jesus is showing his approval, or showing his humility, by not degrading Judas in this moment. Actually, it shows the approval of God to encourage and help others. It shows that God, the greatest, is willing to help the broken, and so should we. And it shows, once again, the power in executing mercy. And so our humble attitude should never be coupled with debility. Humility is not the same as debility. Humility is not self-defeating ourselves. Humility is not apologizing for being who we are, especially made in the image of God. And so also association with Jesus is not debilitating in any way. It's empowering and it's securing. I've got something better. I've got something greater. Association with Jesus is not something to apologize for. It's something to share and something to uphold. Association with the humble Jesus is not in name only. It's submission to God's plan and a trust in that plan. And it's to be coupled with the confidence that we find in God. You are my child and the one that I want to reward. And humility is lifting others up without beating ourselves down. And so humility is not debility. Servitude is not substandard. Mercy is not timidity. Instead, humility is upholding. Servitude is transformative, and mercy is power. And these are the qualities and the characteristics of the strongest. And we could talk about all of these time and time again and exercise our tongue in this matter. But it does no good if we don't exercise our hearts in performing these instead. And maybe we not only need to think of ways that we become the inspiration to others in showing and living, especially from the heart, through humility and servitude and mercy, but maybe we actually need to let others show that to us, which is the hardest thing even more to say. I need the help. I need the way that you can change me as a brother and as a sister. I need what you have to offer as a body, a part of this church. We exercise this not only when we say, I want to help you, but please help me. I am the one that needs mercy. I can serve. I can humbly dedicate myself to Jesus Christ and to this church and not live in self-servitude, but rather live in full servitude to God. And this is what Jesus teaches us in the power of humility. If there's anything that I can do to serve you, you can let me know at any time. Especially right now. If you need forgiveness of sin, and this same Jesus will wash you free of sin, not just in the feet, but we can wash the whole body in baptism and come up a brand new person. Welcome to sit at the table of Jesus in eternity. This is what Jesus wants from us as well. It's what Jesus wants from you. Exercise your heart in making these things happen. You can find me at the back while we sing this song, number 322, Bring Christ Your Broken Life.